to the spending review and what it means for Scotland. The review covers planned spending in the years 2026 to 2029. The UK government says that over that period, an extra £9.1 billion will flow north, about £3 billion per year. The Scottish Government claims, however, that if the Scottish Block Grant had been increased by the overall rise across all UK government departments, the figure would be £1 billion higher. So the first question for all of my three guests, good deal, bad deal? Paul Sweeney.
I think it is a very good deal. It's after, over a decade of Tory constraints on public expenditure, has wreaked havoc across public services in Scotland. Since the budget last autumn and now the spending review, this is a welcome injection of investment and public expenditure in services in Scotland, which is great. I feel it's a bit disingenuous of the Scottish Government to be moaning about the block grant situation, because it is a significant uplift. And, of course, Scotland overall benefits from additional public expenditure at a UK level, such as on defence, social security and energy investments. We know, for example, of £7 billion investment into GB Energy. We've got the £700 million investment into the carbon capture project in Aberdeen. We've got significant shipbuilding projects in Glasgow for the Royal Navy and investment into the Clyde Naval Base, just as a couple of examples, as well as direct investment into the Edinburgh supercomputer. So I think when you take all of those other investments, as well as social security, such as state pensions, which is obviously benefiting the triple lock, you have a significant overall increase in public expenditure in Scotland, which I think is beneficial for the country.
OK, we're going to go to Anne McLaughlin, and I suspect that we're going to get a slightly different take on the spending review.
Slightly different, Bernard. Completely different. And Paul said he's fed up with the Scottish Government complaining about this. But it wasn't just the Scottish Government. It was the Fraser of Allender Institute actually were so compelled to go onto Twitter and say that we have seen some Labour MPs and MSPs describing this as increasing the block grant by £9.1 billion. And it's not the case, and they said it wasn't the right way to describe it. So it's not just the Scottish Government, it's not just the SNP saying it. But I mean, I would make another point. I am so tired of us in Scotland and our government having to wait to see what the UK government decides before we know what we can spend. I'm so tired of the fact that if they decide to increase NHS funding, we'll get an increase in NHS funding.
So do you support full fiscal autonomy, Anne?
Oh, are you interviewing me, Paul?
We might get on to alternative models of funding, because I think the point that Anne McLaughlin is probably making, that with independence you have the full fiscal powers and you don't have to be reliant on a block grant. But of course, I suspect people who don't believe in independence will say, well, you'll be running a massive black hole from day one. But let's not get into that argument for the moment. So just finish your point on the issue that you were making, that in your view, the problem here is that the flexibility that the Scottish Parliament has, in a sense, is contained by Westminster spending decisions.
Yeah, so if they decide that they don't want to, for instance, as they did decide that they didn't want to give pensioners the fuel allowance last year, then the money that would have come as consequentials from that stopped going to the Scottish Government. Thankfully, our Scottish Government decided that they would find the money elsewhere in a very, very tight fiscal situation, because they have their priorities right. But our priorities are mostly dependent on the UK government's priorities, and this Labour government's priorities are not good. OK, well, Paul did ask the question about fiscal autonomy. In the old days, that used to be called assigned revenues, where every tax that was raised in Scotland stayed in Scotland, and the Scottish Parliament would write a cheque to the UK Exchequer for things like defence and foreign policy. And for many, many years, it used to be the policy of the old Scottish Liberal Party. But we have the successor, the Liberal Democrats. Jamie Green is here. But let's get back to the key issue. Spending review, good or bad?
Both, I would say. I think one of the things it did do is demonstrate the strength of Scotland being part of a bigger financial institution, the United Kingdom. The reality is, I mean, I sit in the Public Audit Committee, which is actually a very non-partisan committee. But what we do in that committee is scrutinise the government's accounts every year. We look at the consolidated accounts of the government and we see how much they're spending and how much they're earning. And the reality is there is a massive black hole in the Scottish finance. The Scottish Government spends more than it earns. It more goes out of the coffers than comes into the coffers. So the reality is that the block grant that comes from the UK government helps fund public services in Scotland. Now, I agree with Anne on one point, is that this annual budgeting process makes it very difficult to make medium to long-term decisions as a government. It actually makes it very difficult to reform public services when you're looking solely through the prism of an annual budget. And then the politics gets involved, as you know, Bernard, and then suddenly you can't make sensible decisions anymore because you're trying to drum up support from one party or another to pass the budget. The reality is, I think Scotland has a massive public service black hole. We have a burgeoning NHS bill, a burgeoning welfare bill, and a massive freeze on capital projects, much needed investment in projects that we all want to see, I think. So you can't really, there's a bit of robbing Peter to pay Paul here, because the problem is, Paul, is that the Labour Party are hammering Scottish businesses with the national insurance increase on one hand, and then putting money back into the Scottish economy through the back door and then taking all the credit for it.
Okay, before we drill down perhaps into individual services, you have what's called the cash amount, which comes, and I suppose the starting point in trying to answer this question, good or bad, and all three of you, I think, are sufficiently on message in this, but the starting point, if you're coming to determination, good or bad, of course the cash goes up. But the key question is that, allowing for inflation, is there a real terms increase? Because if there is a real terms increase, then the Parliament has the capacity and the flexibility to do more with the money. So, my question to all three of you, does this represent, and I want a one-word answer, a real terms increase or not? Paul Sweeney?
Yes.
No.
Hopefully.